My name is Isabel Chen, and I'm 28 years old. For 4 years, I let the world believe I was an ordinary woman married to an ordinary man, working an ordinary job at a marketing firm downtown. What almost none of them knew, including my own husband, was that my father built one of the largest shipping empires on the West Coast, and that I had walked away from that world deliberately, wanting to be loved for myself rather than for what I could give someone. I never imagined that choice would nearly cost me everything, or that the same identity I'd hidden to protect my marriage would be the exact thing that ended up saving me from it. The night it happened, I'd come home 20 minutes early from a work dinner and found a text still open on my husband's phone, sitting face up on the kitchen counter where he'd left it while getting a glass of water. A message from a woman named Priya, something intimate and unmistakable glowing on the screen, the kind of message that doesn't leave room for innocent explanation. When I asked him, calmly at first, who Priya was, his face didn't even flicker with guilt. It flickered with irritation, like I'd interrupted something more important than our marriage by simply existing in the kitchen at the wrong moment. When I pressed further, asking how long this had been going on, his jaw tightened in a way I'd learned over the years to recognize as dangerous, though I'd never once seen it cross fully into violence before that night. He crossed the kitchen in 3 fast steps and slapped me, once, then again, and again, 6 times in total, each one harder than the last, while shouting that I had no idea what real love looked like, that Priya understood him in ways I never had, that I'd made him feel small and unambitious for years without ever once realizing it. I stood there afterward, my cheek burning, my ears ringing faintly, and said nothing at all, which seemed to surprise him more than any scream could have. He expected tears, apologies, the same collapse into forgiveness he'd trained me into over smaller cruelties for years. Instead, I simply picked up my purse from the counter and walked calmly toward the bathroom, locking the door behind me before he could register what my silence actually meant. To understand how I ended up standing silently in that kitchen absorbing 6 slaps without fighting back the way anyone watching might expect, you have to understand the 4 years leading up to that moment. I met Daniel at a small gallery opening, back when I was still using my mother's maiden name professionally, deliberately distancing myself from the Chen Maritime Group and the wealth attached to it. I'd grown up watching my father's business associates court my parents with a transparency that always felt hollow, calculated, designed to extract something rather than build something genuine, and by the time I was old enough to date seriously, I'd developed a quiet, permanent suspicion of anyone who seemed a little too interested in where I came from. Daniel never asked probing questions about my family, never seemed particularly curious about the modest apartment I kept or the salary I earned at a job well beneath what my education could have gotten me elsewhere. I mistook his lack of curiosity for security, for the kind of love that didn't need leverage to exist, and I fell for him steadily over 8 months before we married in a small courthouse ceremony my parents attended quietly, understanding and respecting my wish to keep our worlds separate for as long as I needed to. What I didn't account for was how Daniel would slowly change once the excitement of a new marriage faded into routine, once financial stress crept into our modest joint accounts, and he began comparing our life unfavorably to friends whose spouses came from money he assumed I didn't have access to. He met Priya at his firm's holiday party 2 years into our marriage, and within months, what began as harmless office friendship became something else entirely, something I sensed long before I ever found concrete proof of it. The slaps that night weren't the first sign of his temper, though they were the first time it turned fully physical. In the months before that, Daniel had grown sharper with his words, calling me boring, unambitious, criticizing the modest life I'd built as though I'd failed some unspoken standard he never clearly articulated but constantly measured me against. He'd started staying late at the office with increasing frequency, always with some plausible explanation involving a project or a client dinner, always slightly too polished, too rehearsed to fully believe. When Priya's name started appearing more frequently in his conversations, I asked questions gently at first, careful not to sound accusatory. And each time, Daniel accused me of being paranoid, of not trusting him after everything he'd given me, twisting my quiet concern into evidence of my own inadequacy as a partner. He'd raised his voice before, slammed doors before, once put his fist through drywall in our hallway during an argument about money. But that night, with the text message glowing openly on his phone, something in him finally crossed into violence, as if my discovering the truth was somehow a greater offense than the affair itself had ever been. Priya had apparently told him, over months of quiet encouragement, that I would never understand real passion, real ambition, and he'd absorbed her words completely, using them like a weapon each time his hand connected with my face. What Daniel never knew, standing over me in that kitchen breathing hard after the sixth slap, was that my father, Richard Chen, had built an empire worth over $4 billion, and that despite everything I'd sacrificed to hide that fact for the sake of an ordinary marriage, I still kept one number saved in my phone under a name Daniel had never once asked about. My father's head of legal affairs, a woman named Counselor Reyes, who had personally handled every sensitive matter our family had faced for over a decade, discreetly, efficiently, without mercy for anyone who threatened the people she was hired to protect. I'd walked away from my inheritance emotionally, not legally, understanding even as a young woman that the version of myself I wanted Daniel to love needed to exist entirely separate from my father's world, untouched by the assumptions people made about money. But standing in that locked bathroom with my cheek throbbing, staring at my own reflection in a mirror that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I understood with total clarity that the woman willing to disappear for love was not the same woman willing to disappear for abuse. I dialed Counselor Reyes's number with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and when she answered on the second ring, I said only, "It's Isabel. I need you to activate the protocol we discussed years ago, the one I hoped I'd never need." Within an hour, Counselor Reyes had already begun the quiet, precise process my family's legal team had perfected over decades of protecting the Chen name from exactly this kind of situation. Photographs were taken discreetly at an emergency room across town, documented by a physician my father's team trusted completely and had used for sensitive matters before. A restraining order was drafted and filed before sunrise, moving through the court system with a speed that only decades of legal relationships could produce. By morning, Daniel's employer, a firm that depended heavily on maritime shipping contracts for nearly a third of its annual revenue, received formal notice that Chen Maritime Group would be reviewing all current business relationships in light of a serious personal matter involving one of the firm's senior associates. Daniel didn't understand any of it yet when he woke that morning, still confident, still certain I'd forgive him the way I always had before, already rehearsing an apology built around blaming stress and Priya's manipulation rather than his own choices. He didn't understand until his supervisor called him into an emergency meeting 3 days later, explaining, visibly shaken, that Chen Maritime Group had specifically named him in a formal complaint, and that the firm's largest client was reconsidering their entire multi-year contract in direct response. Daniel finally asked his supervisor the question he should have asked me 4 years earlier, the question that unraveled everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married and mistreated. His face went through several stages of disbelief when he finally connected the pieces that afternoon, when he realized the modest, unambitious wife he'd mocked for months was the only daughter of a man whose name appeared on shipping contracts worth more than his entire firm's client roster combined. He called me 11 times that day, alternating between apology and panic, each voicemail increasingly desperate as his professional world began quietly collapsing around a decision he could never undo. Priya, once she understood the actual scale of what Daniel had lost, along with the very real possibility of criminal charges attached to his name, disappeared from his life within the week, unwilling to remain anywhere near the consequences she'd helped provoke. The divorce proceeded quickly once my legal team became fully involved, Daniel's own attorney advising him firmly to settle rather than risk a public trial that would expose both the assault and his affair to a level of scrutiny his career could never survive. He lost his position at the firm within 2 months, his reputation trailing him quietly into subsequent job interviews that never seemed to work out, always for reasons no one would explain directly, doors closing softly in ways he couldn't trace back to any single source, but somehow always understood. I moved back into my own name fully for the first time in years, stepping, finally, into rooms I'd once avoided, out of a desire to be loved separately from my father's legacy. I took a position within Chen Maritime Group's philanthropic foundation, work I found meaningful in ways my old marketing job never had, surrounded by people who respected my judgment because of what I actually contributed, not despite the name attached to it, and not because of it either. Looking back now, I understand that hiding my identity never protected my marriage the way I'd hoped it would. It only delayed the moment Daniel revealed exactly who he truly was, a man capable of real violence the instant he believed there would be no real consequence waiting for him afterward. I don't regret choosing an ordinary life for those 4 years, the friendships I built, the small satisfactions of an ordinary job well done. I only regret believing, even briefly, that his cruelty deserved my silence for even one more day than it actually received. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your quiet strength for weakness, you already understand exactly what it feels like when the truth finally, completely, speaks for itself, and exactly why staying silent about who you are was never the same thing as staying silent about what someone did to you.